The shift didn't happen with an explosion. It happened quietly, in conference rooms thousands of miles from Washington, while the American political class was distracted by spectacle. While attention was fixed on social media posts and retaliatory threats typed in all caps, something far more consequential was unfolding. The global system that once revolved around the United States began learning how to operate without it. In New Delhi, the European Union's most powerful official stood beside India's Prime Minister, not as a ceremonial guest, but as a partner finalizing the architecture of a trade agreement that had been stalled for 2 decades. 20 years of hesitation dissolved in a moment of clarity. Not because the obstacles vanished, but because the alternative, continued dependence on an erratic United States, had become more dangerous than compromise. This is the part of the story that rarely makes the headlines. Trade deals are not just about tariffs and quotas. They are about trust, predictability, whether the signature on a document will still matter next month. And increasingly, nations around the world have reached the same conclusion. Any agreement tethered to Donald Trump is provisional at best, meaningless at worst. The scene in India was deliberate. Republic Day is not a backdrop chosen lightly. It is a display of sovereignty, military strength, and national self-confidence. By standing there, the European Union was signaling that it sees India not as a secondary market, not as a hedge, but as a central pillar of a new economic order. Together, the EU and India represent nearly a fifth of global trade. Their combined markets approach 2 billion people. Their GDP share rivals that of the United States, and for the first time, they are acting like it. This deal did not come together because global conditions were favorable. It came together because global conditions were dangerous. Because American policy, once the stabilizing force of the post-war order, has become volatile, personal, and transactional. Tariffs are imposed and withdrawn like mood swings. Alliances are treated as leverage. Long-standing commitments are reframed as acts of charity. And every partner, no matter how loyal, is told to prepare for punishment if compliance is deemed insufficient. Over the last several weeks alone, trade partners were told they had deals, then discovered those deals were effectively nullified by sudden threats. South Korea was informed that its legislature's internal process constituted defiance. Canada was warned that diversification would be treated as betrayal. European nations were targeted for policies entirely unrelated to trade. Even hypothetical disagreements were met with punitive rhetoric. From the outside, this looks less like negotiation and more like coercion, less like leadership and more like volatility. And global markets, which are not sentimental, have responded accordingly. The lesson being absorbed in capitals from Berlin to Seoul is simple. You cannot plan around a partner who may reverse course without notice. You cannot invest billions into supply chains that hinge on the temperament of a single individual. You cannot build long-term economic resilience on top of short-term political theatrics. That is why the European Union and India accelerated a process that had languished for 20 years. That is why tariff reductions that once seemed politically impossible are suddenly achievable. India agreed to slash automotive tariffs from triple digits to levels competitive with global norms. European exporters gained access to one of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world. Indian sectors from pharmaceuticals to technology gained preferential entry into European supply chains. This is not theoretical. These are structural shifts. Factories will be built, shipping routes will change, investment flows will reorient. And once those decisions are made, they are rarely reversed. While this was happening, the United States was doing something else entirely. It was signaling to the world that agreements are conditional not on law, but on loyalty. That legislative independence is unacceptable. That sovereign decision-making will be punished. This is not how alliances function. It is how protection rackets function. There is a reason why seasoned diplomats reacted with alarm rather than outrage. Outrage fades, alarm mobilizes. And what they see is a pattern that goes far beyond trade. This is not about tariffs. It is about an authoritarian approach to international relations where unpredictability is mistaken for strength, where pressure replaces persuasion, where the goal is not mutual benefit, but dominance. We have seen this playbook before. Strongman leaders often believe that constant escalation keeps opponents off balance. In the short term, it can. In the long term, It creates incentives for everyone else to coordinate against you. The Soviet Union learned this. Imperial Japan learned this. Even France in the late 20th century learned this when it attempted to chart an isolated economic path. History does not reward nations that confuse fear with respect. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it is unfolding alongside another crisis that does not wait for political cycles: climate change. While governments are restructuring trade to stabilize supply chains and reduce vulnerability, the environmental clock is accelerating. New data shows that impacts once projected for the middle of the century are already here. Heat records are falling with alarming regularity. Ocean temperatures are breaking modern records. Extreme weather events are not anomalies. They are becoming baseline conditions. Wildfires, floods, hurricanes, each one compounding the economic and humanitarian costs of the last. This matters because trade, climate, and security are no longer separable. Supply chains are disrupted by storms. Agricultural output is reshaped by heat. Migration pressures increase. Insurance markets strain. And nations that cannot coordinate responses find themselves exposed on multiple fronts at once. The European Union understands this. India understands this. Their trade agreement is not just about commerce. It is about resilience, about building networks that can withstand shocks: economic, environmental, geopolitical. It is about reducing dependence on any single actor whose policies might amplify those shocks rather than mitigate them. Contrast that with the messaging coming from Washington. Instead of coordination, there is confrontation. Instead of planning, there is improvisation. Instead of acknowledging systemic risk, there is denial or distraction. Even allies that once assumed American protection are recalibrating. Polling across Europe shows a dramatic collapse in public perception of the United States as a reliable partner. In some countries, fewer than 1 in 5 citizens still see America as an ally. This is not anti-Americanism in the abstract. It is risk assessment. Governments answer to voters. And voters are watching a country that once championed rule-based order now treat rules as optional. They are watching treaties treated as leverage. They are watching democratic processes abroad framed as obstacles rather than expressions of sovereignty. This erosion of trust has legal implications. International trade is governed by frameworks that assume good faith. When one party repeatedly signals that agreements are temporary, enforcement mechanisms weaken, arbitration becomes less effective, dispute resolution slows, costs rise for everyone. Domestically, this approach also carries constitutional risk. Trade authority in the United States is not unilateral. Congress has defined roles. International commitments intersect with domestic law. When executive action repeatedly tests those boundaries, it invites legal challenges that create uncertainty at home as well as abroad. But perhaps the most damaging consequence is psychological. When a nation behaves as though cooperation is weakness, it trains others to stop cooperating. When it treats alliances as zero-sum, it pushes partners to seek alternatives. And once those alternatives are established, leverage disappears. This is why Canada's leadership has shifted from reaction to strategy. After years of absorbing pressure, Ottawa has made clear that diversification is no longer optional. East-West trade, once dismissed, is being rebuilt. Relationships with Europe and Asia are deepening. This is not defiance, it is adaptation. And when American officials respond by insisting that dependence makes resistance futile, they reveal a profound misunderstanding of how power works in the modern world. Dependence breeds resentment. Resentment breeds exit strategies. And exit strategies, once viable, are executed quietly. The rhetoric directed at smaller nations has been particularly revealing. Comments about healthcare systems, sovereignty, even territorial integrity are deployed not as policy arguments, but as intimidation. This is not statesmanship. It is signaling to domestic audiences that strength is being displayed regardless of whether outcomes improve. Even within the American political ecosystem, contradictions abound. Allies are urged to stand up to adversaries abroad while being threatened at home. Democratic values are invoked selectively. Military intervention is demanded in some cases, ignored in others, based less on principle than on convenience. This inconsistency is not lost on global audiences. It reinforces the perception that U.S. policy is no longer anchored to doctrine, but to impulse. And impulse is impossible to hedge against. Meanwhile, the climate data continues to worsen. Heat-related deaths are rising. Floods are displacing millions. The economic toll is mounting, even in years insurers describe as relatively calm. These are not projections, they are balance sheets. The irony is that addressing climate risk requires exactly the kind of international cooperation that is being undermined. Coordinated investment, shared standards, predictable policy, long-term planning. All of these are made harder when the largest historical emitter signals disengagement or hostility. And yet, other nations are moving forward anyway. Europe is tightening emissions targets. India is balancing development with transition. Supply chains are being redesigned with sustainability in mind. Trade agreements increasingly incorporate environmental standards, not as afterthoughts, but as core provisions. This is the future taking shape without American leadership. Not because the world wants to exclude the United States, but because it no longer knows whether inclusion is viable. At the center of this shift is a simple realization. Strength in the 21st century is not measured by how loudly you threaten, but by how many others are willing to align with you voluntarily. It is measured by trust, credibility, and the capacity to coordinate complex responses to complex problems. When those qualities erode, power does not disappear overnight. It leaks, slowly, then suddenly. What we are witnessing now is that leak becoming visible. Trade corridors rerouting, diplomatic language changing, public opinion hardening, institutional memory adjusting. These are not reversible with a single election cycle. They are path-dependent. This is why the EU-India deal matters so much. It is not an isolated event. It is a signal flare. It tells the world that alternatives are not only possible, but operational. That waiting for stability in Washington is no longer the default option. And once that lesson is learned, it spreads. There will be those who argue that tariffs can be negotiated away, that rhetoric will soften, that relationships can be repaired. Some of that may be true, but trust, once broken repeatedly, is not restored by promises. It is restored by patterns of behavior over time. So far, the pattern is clear. Agreements are conditional, compliance is subjective, punishment is arbitrary, and loyalty is demanded rather than earned. This is not how durable influence is built. It is how empires exhaust themselves. The most sobering part is that none of this was inevitable. The post-war order, for all its flaws, created unprecedented prosperity and stability. It relied on rules, institutions, and the understanding that leadership meant restraint as well as power. Walking away from that does not make a nation freer, it makes it lonelier. And in a world facing converging crises, economic, environmental, security-related, loneliness is a strategic liability. The question now is not whether the global system is changing, it is how quickly and whether the United States will recognize the shift in time to shape it rather than be shaped by it. Because while political theater may dominate headlines, history is being written elsewhere. In trade agreements signed quietly, in supply chains redesigned deliberately, in alliances recalibrated patiently. 10 years from now, analysts will look back at this period and identify moments when the trajectory became clear, when the warnings were visible, when the choices were stark. This is one of those moments. If this analysis connected dots for you, you're part of a community that refuses to look away. Hit subscribe, not for me, but because truth needs witnesses.